Biological, earth and space sciences. This week we're talking about engagement. And engagement is a little bit of a web that gets overlaying all of our inquiry-based approaches, all of the problem-based learning that we're trying to do in our science classrooms. And this week obviously we're going to look at how engagement fits into that. We've talked about the 5 E's. We've talked about POE as strategy. Let's have a look at engagement in terms of how it can be structured and embedded within the actual practice, what Vygotsky would call our zone of proximal development, where we're working, the trench warfare of teaching. So let's have a look. Here we go, an invitation to you as a learner. If you could meet and do lunch with one scientist from history, who would it be and why? Just look at that for a moment. You can feel the shift. You can feel the invitation to you as a learner. All of a sudden science is not something out there. Science is in me. What do I know? Who do I know? Who are these people? Einstein people may actually recognise. Madame Curie, your students may actually recognise. David Gineopon, they may recognise. And Noam Chomsky, of course, they may recognise. But these are very, very famous scientific thinkers, writers, practitioners, really interesting people in their own right. And certainly 4 people that I would love to do lunch with. But can't you feel the shift there? Isn't this even slightly engaging? To think that scientists are actually people. Who are they? What is the story behind the science story? A little web of engagement. David Gineopon, again, one of our curriculum priorities, of course, is Indigenous perspectives. And David Gineopon, as you can see, he lived to a ripe old age, 95. He's on our $50 note, just in case you weren't aware. And that piece of machinery behind him is actually a piece of shearing equipment that he modified and invented. And of course, at the time when David was a scientist and a thinker and writer, shearing, of course, was the backbone of our country's wealth. A Nagindiri man, had a very basic education, made a lot of groundbreaking rural and land-based inventions. Published also an explicit and very well-known writer, and published Native Legends in 1929, and was always a strong advocate and campaigner for improvements to Indigenous life and living standards. So a man well ahead of his times. And when we're talking about Indigenous perspectives on science, keep a $50 note in your wallet and keep David Gineopon up your sleeve, because he has some excellent stories and is also a writer. So he's got lots of information for you to share with students. And of course the other person on the $50 note, let's not forget, also a minority scientist, Edith Cowan, of course, a social worker, feminist, and she's on the flip side of the $50 note. Introduction. Engagement is not simply being focused in class. Okay? Engagement is affected by emotional, behavioural and external factors. So when the child comes to the science classroom, they are bringing everything that preceded that class, and they are also harbouring some questions and some issues and some perspectives on what will precede that class. So this topic outlines models of teaching that increase student engagement. We're going to revisit the 5 E's and the POE teaching models are about, preparing lesson plans. We know that, we've been there and done it, and we're going to have a look at how we can be using those to engage students to enhance learning. So at the end of the topic, again, some active, some transitive things you should be able to do. Define engagement. List factors that affect engagement. We talk about big E and little e factors. Identify barriers to engagement. Describe models of teaching science that lead to engagement. And explain ways of preparing lessons for engagement. So, a fairly lengthy list of things to do. Key terms. Engagement. It's a situation, it's a state of mind when students are deeply involved with their learning. Picture it. It's an image. That image can be constructed using the 5 E's. A 5-stage teaching model. POE is an 8-phase model. It also works just as well. It focuses on student learning by becoming engaged, by scaffolding and stepping the students into an activity that links their prior knowledge, and then exploring and elaborating on their new knowledge about a concept. So it's a pathway in and a pathway out. The 5 E's, POE. It's not simply an exchange of knowledge and terms. Now they're low-end pedagogies. We don't accept low-end pedagogies. Low-end pedagogies are a strategy. They will enable us to step into a topic, But it's the high-end strategies, the high-end pedagogies, where we want our students exiting a topic. We want them coming out to elaborate and explore new knowledge about a new concept. And the final term we're going to talk about this week is motivation, the drive and willingness to expend energy. Okay, not every student is motivated. Etienne Wenger, fabulous Canadian theorist and French-Canadian theorist, talked about identities of participation and identities of non-participation in your classroom. He did his initial PhD thesis on postal workers in the United States, would you believe it or not, and he studied them, and which included everything from sitting in the public toilets, listening to them, and issues beyond that. And he studied these people in depth, and he worked out that people in that organisation were working just as hard to participate and be positive and be good corporate citizens as others were at working at not participating, as slacking, as turning up late, as taking all the shortcuts they possibly could. Either way, in your classroom you will have students who will have an identity of participation, others who will have an identity of non-participation, and then you'll have a few in between who will shift and change. Motivation, a big issue. Gregson talks about the elements of engagement, and he breaks it down, or they break it down quite nicely. Gregson is the author of the textbook. It's a compilation of different authors' work. So as we can see up in the right-hand corner, engagement has a whole range of meanings. Probably one Gregson didn't intend, but we can see figure 5.2, the behavioural, the emotional, and the cognitive, and this is a really interesting interaction. The behavioural issues, involvement in academic and participation in social and extracurricular activities. We all know the isolates. We all know the children who have motor issues. We all know these kids in our classroom, and their behaviours do impose limitations on their capacity to engage for a whole range of reasons. Emotional, positive and negative reactions to school, classroom, teachers, peers, the home. Every time the student comes to school, the home comes with it. That sense of belonging, ownership, and learning. We know from our theories of childhood development that you have 25, 30 children sitting in front of you, and each of them will have had a different history and story. Cognitive influences, thoughtfulness, willingness, comprehension skills, okay, and the capacity to master difficult skills, styles of learning, learning preferences. If we look at the Myers-Briggs inventory, we all prefer to learn and act in a certain mode. In a classroom, often the teacher doesn't teach to different modes, and if you don't teach to different modes, then clearly you're impacting on that whole issue of engagement, and that's what this week's topic's all about: multimodal teaching. We can see, for instance, our brain, when we talk about cognitive and perceptive phases, we all read that to be the cat. Yet we know, for instance, that the two middle letters are quite different, and our brain fills in the blanks. And this happens to us in all of our learning. Our brain, it actually functions much more quickly than our eye, and we can see from this particular perspective that we can, our brain fills in gaps that the eye actually perceives. Another little example here when you look at the impact of the brain on our learning, and this is a left brain, right brain conflict issue. And some of you, for instance, will have no trouble with this task, and I'll just pause and let you have a go at it. The task basically says look at the chart and say the colour, not the word. See how many you can get right. Look at the chart for a while, look at it for 5 seconds, look at it for 10 seconds, and then give it a try. Green, red, blue, yellow, blue, black. As you can see, there is a real cognitive conflict happening there. And like it or not, these cognition issues are part of our learning culture. So a teacher in a classroom is going to have to deconstruct many of these in order to be truly effective, to be truly multimodal. Two short examples there. The cat and the colour chart, just to show how significant and how compelling our cognitive training and our cognitive modelling is. So we come to the 5E model. Okay, and we can see there, engage is the first stage. Explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate. So we're moving, scaffolding in through engagement, creating pathways. We are then beginning to explore, doing some conceptual development, some mixing, some deconstruction. We then start to explain, where we take the deconstruction and we start to piece it together. Okay, once something's been deconstructed, you know, for instance, then you go to a restaurant, you can have a deconstructed cheesecake. It looks nothing like Nana's cheesecake, but by the time you piece it together and mix it around with your fork and have some of the raspberry juices and blend it all together, you can actually sense the cheesecake. So you're reconstructing the cheesecake there at the explain point. Elaborate. Okay, we're starting to look at the application to the real world. Evaluate. We're starting to take that idea out into the real world and sort of see how we test it, how it works. And the principles here is that I can intentionally build relationships with and among students through carefully planned activities. I can design instruction that promotes an engaged and active learning environment. I can. And I can explain how assessment can be active and engaging. That is, how it can elaborate formative assessment and evaluate, when I move out into the real world, summative assessment, such that I can actually measure student engagement with their world and also have some idea of the deep pedagogies that can facilitate understanding. Think back to these stages. How would you really engage students if you wanted to teach them a science task? Invite each student to colour the room with science. A photograph, a poster, a piece of artwork, a newspaper clipping or a magazine cover, a quote of the day. You know, you can lead that process as the teacher for the first 2 to 4 weeks, and then students choose and contribute their own. A science graffiti board, where they leave messages for each other, appropriate, of course, which may relate to some of the science work or some of the science testing or some of the observations of bird life in the school ground that they're actually making, or some species management tasks you're giving them. A simple method: laminate the whiteboard paper and use dry erase markers, where they can actually create their own little graffiti board, which is actually going to give them an opportunity to own their classroom, to own their science thinking. Think back to a time when you were engaged and what that engagement was like. What facilitated that engagement? What motivated it? Gregson talks about the small E and big E engagement. Big E engagement is the student who gets it. School is for me, education is resource, this is my life, this is my future. Small E engagement, okay, students are engaged in active participation. That is, there's behaviours are increasing, learning behaviours are increasing, there's genuine valuing of what's going on, there's some positive regard in terms of emotion. There's reflective involvement and deep understanding and experience, so we can see some changes in behaviour, cognition and emotion through small E engagement. So some students come to the school environment loving the environment. They have the big E engagement. The challenge is to keep extending those students. Some students come at different levels of engagement. The small E engagement, and here's where the teacher does a lot of their most effective work. And we do this work by thinking through our class procedures and learning activities, how we arrange the room, who our students as clients are. Are we going to use, as this picture indicates, learning stations? Are we going to have a little kinesthetic touch and feel bench? Are we going to have a central whiteboard here where the learners are as much owners of that whiteboard, that territory, that real estate classroom, real estate? They're going to earn it as much as the teacher does. Are we going to have little corners, okay, where students can actually relax and chill and go for breakout activities? And are we going to have conversation pits? Going back to the great days of the Greeks and the Socratics, on the island of Crete, where the whole island was committed to conversational purposes. In India, New Delhi, there are rooms in houses, rooms in dedicated halls and civic centres where people go to just to converse, just to speak. And so what we need to do in our classroom is create the real estate for that to happen. Some basic principles. Make sure all students can see and hear clearly. Allow room and easy access for students with special needs, as well as proximity control, so that you can actually get around there and monitor and facilitate the learning and do the coaching that you need to do. Coach from the side, okay? Be the sage on the stage sometimes, move up to the whiteboard. Be the meddler in the middle as you walk around the tables. And sometimes, just be that reflective person that you can be on the side. Create the room to be the person who can facilitate that small E engagement. So when we look at students, they're involved in issues they regard as vital concerns. This is when they're engaged. They're being helpful to see major concepts, big ideas, general principles, not just isolated facts. This is the work of a philosopher called Martin Habermas, and he published this in 1996, and he looked at a philosophy for teaching, a radical pedagogy for teaching kids in disadvantaged areas. The work of Habermas has now been generalised. Obviously you can see it embedded in the Australian curriculum for science. You can see it in the framework there, but it's very much a libertarian philosophy on teaching, and it's embedded in the baccalaureate. It's embedded in the Reggio Emilia philosophies and the Rudolf Steiner schools, and is now embedded in the Australian curriculum. So students get to, they're being helped to see the major concepts, the big ideas, the general principles, not just the isolated facts. Look at the date here, over 20 years ago. It's now current in Australian curriculum, so we're catching up. There's planning involved in applying ideals such as fairness, equity and justice to their world. So here is the 5th E, taking it out to the world. What is the point of science if it doesn't have an application? What is the point of scientific understanding if it's not going to lead to a better world, if it's not consistent with our values? Martin Habermas, if you get a chance, look at his work. Very, very liberating. Student engagement defined. Okay, we can look at what student engagement is. If we needed a definition, students who are engaged are involved, but not all students who are involved or engaged. And we can see the dichotomy there. Engaged is in a combination of attentiveness, persistence, connectedness, and commitment. And we can see this particular model at work. Students are attentive, they're persistent in their learning because they're engaged, they're hooked. They're connected to their learning task, and often through peers or often through individual steps or even worksheets if we're going to look at the POE model. And they're also committed. They're committed to following through and pursuing their own inquiry and leading to deeper understanding. So the teacher steps through each of these 4 phases. Attentive can be led very much by the sage, and on the stage the person at the front. The persistence can be encouraged by the person wandering, the meddler in the middle, moving around the classroom, supporting all this learning. The connectedness, again, standing beside the learner, okay, the guide on the side. And the commitment, again, can be pushed by the students themselves, internally and externally mediated. There are 5 basic student responses to work. We can see engagement, and that represents a combination, if we had a matrix, of high attention and high commitment to the task at hand. Then you'll see students at the second level, and you'll see these 5 different students. Can you imagine a class of 25 students, and you're roughly going to have 5 groups of 5. And you're going to have your engaged students, high intention, high commitment. You're going to have those students who are strategically compliant, the ones who follow the guides of the platoon leader. They'll have high attention, but they'll have low commitment to the task at hand because it's functional. Ritual compliance, low attention and low commitment to the task at hand. The guy's just going through the motion. Retreatism, no attention, no commitment. And finally, rebellion. Now, that 5th group, the identities of non-participation, kids who are actively saying, I'm not going to participate, as Wenger would say. And they're working hard to create that identity around that. Those 5 kids in our 25 strong classroom, they seem to get most of the teacher's attention. Again, something else to think about when you're talking about engagement. Where am I going to pitch my effort? Where am I going to focus? If you ever get the chance to be profiled as part of your prac placements, please jump at the chance, because you may find a disturbing pattern where you're spending 30% of your time addressing 5 rebellious students, and only 70% of your time teaching 20 engaged and semi-engaged students. Typical student activities. When students are engaged, we can see a high level of creation, evaluation, analyse, application, understanding, and remembering. Those are strategically compliant. We can see the recall and remember pictures in. So the memory, when we're working at the strategic compliant level, it's not actually going from our working memory to our long-term memory in the same way that we might like it. An engaged student is going through this synthesis of tasks and converting that remembrance through evaluation an application to real-world scenarios. A strategically compliant student may go through those motions, but they'll retain only those bits that they think are important to them. If someone who's ritually compliant, as you can see, a lot of similarities, going through a lot of the same steps, but again, someone who's ritually compliant may be doing this because they're going to be tested on it. They may be doing it because they have to write a report. So there's going to be some recall there, but it's all going to be short-term stuff. Now, in the past, I've talked about the 4 levels of learning and the 4 levels of memory. I think these are really critical when we're designing a classroom, because when we're talking about being engaged, we are addressing all 4 levels of memory. When we're talking about being strategically compliant, we can see that it's less successful. Okay, working memory and short-term memory are probably the dominant formats. Ritually compliance, again, short-term memory, things go in and they go out. Retrievist students, they actually learn little. They harbour negative attitudes about the classroom, and they can often disengage and disrupt as lessons go on or as units of study go on, because their disengagement and their lack of understanding, it's like compounding interest. The disengagement is slight at the start, but as the unit goes on it gets worse. And then of course we've got our rebellion happening here. Students who learn little, negative attitudes, and just disrupt from the outset. So your engagement strategy is going to have to address a wide range of behaviours, and here we're talking about that behavioural component. Now, the factors that affect engagement, we can see that I've actually gone through and tried to break them down into, as Gregson has done, students' based perspectives, the teachers' based perspective, whole school's perspectives. Now, these are really, really important. If a student exists in a culture, in a school culture, in which they have little belief in the efficacy of that culture or the fairness, or they fail to see reward systems in place, or fail to see parts of that community evolving and developing, it's going to be very hard for that student to flourish in that environment. Parents, family members, the most dominant factor in student success in most modern research is the relationship between the parent and the school. So it's really important that parental relationships, that when you do establish an engagement strategy in your class, that you are connecting it to the home, hopefully, that you are doing some outreach strategies there, that parents are included. And of course the community, bring in the outside community. And the outside community, of course, is places people, the students go to, people the students know, and this helps the students to see their world as a scientific one, when they can actually combine what they're doing. They can locate what they're doing in the practices of their own communities. So what are they doing? Okay, when we look at, for instance, the Year 1 Science Understanding, Earth Sciences, we can look at the elaborations here. Okay, observable changes occur in the sky and landscapes, and we can look at units of study, exploring the local environment to identify and describe changes. We can look at short and long-term weather patterns, and we can also look at celestial observation, skies, weathering, and in here, of course, we can then start to look at some aspects of the Indigenous perspective. So, as a teacher, we're asking the Australian curriculum in science is asking you to step between cultures, and the reason we're stepping between cultures is so we can highlight how each culture actually enhances and supports the other. Not that one is right, not that one is wrong, not that one is what we would call elaborated, an elaborated culture, for instance Western culture, and one is poorly elaborated or subservient or ill-informed, for instance traditional cultures. We now know that science has led us to an understanding that that is not the case. What we're seeing are complementary scientific frameworks. Engagement strategies help students make a personal connection to the lesson. Obvious things, names, interest, hobbies, cultures, where are you from? Really interesting questions. Present a slideshow. Have students create their own PowerPoint summary key points of your lesson, or of who they are and what interests them about the lesson. For instance, if we go back to the very start of this session, which member of the scientific community they would like to have lunch with. Invite guest speakers in. bring them in. Use a variety of media, cartoons, music magazines, a range of things. Display a statement on the board. Immediately play a video that supports that statement. Surprise the students with theatre. Use theatre techniques to stage a reenactment. I remember one thing I used to do as a teacher, I had a box of hats. And sometimes I would put the hat on and reenact a character from history or a local politician or a national identity. And then I would throw another hat to another student who had to assume an opposing view or a different political or a different aesthetic position. And we would have that elaborate discussion. And then the hats would be passed around the room. Really interesting, very simple inflections on de Bono type techniques. The Emu Story. For instance, when we look at astrology, we know, for instance, that every traditional culture in Australia has a story about the emu. Now, Western society, for instance, we know it as Orion, the belt of Orion. But if you have a look, for instance, and we see Orion very much as the archer up here in the top left-hand corner, you can see our elaboration on it. Indigenous culture, however, uses the emu metaphor to capture the science and astrology behind charting space. So before you raise an issue, post procedures in a prominent place. How we're going to do this. Here are the rules for engagement. Determine the purpose of what you're about to discuss. Okay, we're about to discuss stars. Okay, we're going to have a look at what Orion's belt is. And then you may, for instance, split the class into two. The other class are going to look at Dreamtime stories, what the Emu Story is. And maybe after, when you bring it together, okay, you can have the retelling of important points, the written summary, the bringing together of cultures. And above all, get out of the way. Let the science happen. Let the engagement happen. Let the people discussing Orion's belt get together and listen to the people discussing the Emu Story. Let the people with the Emu Story chuckle as the other group discusses Orion's belt. And then sit back in fascination as you watch these two stories unfold. And increase in science understanding grow. One of the tasks for this week was viewing the video on making science engaging. Please have a look at it. It demonstrates a number of strategies that can be used to gauge science in learners, and it brings us pretty much back to what Confucius said, in 400 BC, almost 3,000 years ago. What I hear, I forget. What I see, I remember. What I do, I understand. Benjamin Franklin repeated these terms, as he sat under the tree and got hit on the head by an apple. And of course started to produce the first laws of physics. Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. Now, when you watch this video this week, we've actually put together a little summary of what the good aspects of teaching science are, making science engaging. Students explain things to each other. We just go back to that story on Orion's belt and the Emu Story. Really important that students engage and explain things to each other, that they get it, that you hear the penny drop. Make the classroom busy so there's no behaviour issues. So that when those resistors sit round and start to see there's a lot of things happening around them, they may want to buy into that. And of course, if the classroom is busy and there's so many things happen, then you, as the meddler in the middle, can come around and you can support that buy-in. Okay, you can actually help those students on the periphery who are wondering whether to engage or not. You can do your one-to-one Vygotsky work there. You can actually do some really, really good constructivist teaching. And make sure it's student-centred. It has to be absolutely student-centred. Why are we doing this? Who do you want to come to lunch? These are all critical questions. Don't copy from the book. Don't leave them alone. And above all, don't make science a head thing. It's not a head thing. It's a futuristic, it's a totally existential thing. And we know that by looking at two different cultures. The brain. And I just want to remind you of this again, because this is a really important part of engagement. It does not function as audio or visual tape recorder. We often think, and this is a great Western myth, that we can pick up a cookbook and read a recipe and instantly we know how to cook. I mean, my partner will tell you that's not the case. Some things don't work. We do this. We can read a play and think we've got empathy. We can watch Hamlet and think we never need to watch Hamlet again because we got it in one. But our brain is not a function. an audio, a visual tape recorder. We don't get things in one hit. There are processes we have to go through. Our learning needs to be scaffolded. So incoming information is constantly being processed, and the brain is constantly sifting. We have a little function in a brain called the amygdala, and the amygdala is actually our crap detector. So picture yourself at a nightclub, and there you see someone you're really attracted to, and a drink later you've managed to get their phone number. Chances are you remember that phone number. An hour later you meet someone you're not that attracted to, and they give you their phone number. You're not going to remember it. Now you may think, oh, that's a law of attraction. Actually it's not, it's amygdala. Your brain is currently processing information. There is so much stimulus coming in all the time that your brain actually works out what it needs to keep and process, what it values and what it doesn't. And the three things it asks itself: have I heard or seen this information before? Yes, okay. Working memory kicks in. Working memory connects to long-term memory. Okay, and you got something going. Where does this information fit in? What can I do with it? Can I assume that this is the same idea that I had yesterday or last month? Now, these are the three really interesting questions your brain asks. Have I seen or heard it before? Yes. Connection, neuron fires. No? Okay. Where does it fit in then? Okay, where does it fit in amongst my current neurons? Where can I hang it? What can I do with it? And can I assume that this is the same idea that I had yesterday or last month? Now, you can see, based on this model of the brain, we can actually structure our 5E lesson, can't we? We can actually say to ourselves, okay, here is this information that you've seen before. Here is the previous, the linking material. Where does what we're going to do today fit in? Okay, remember we did this? Well, here's what we're going to do with it. What can I do with this? Wow, let's look outside the window. Let's look into the real world. Has anyone seen this? Did anyone watch that story on the news last night? Did anyone read this in the newspaper? Hand out a copy of the article. What is that about? Okay, go to a foreign news country. Bring it into the real world. Make it matter to the students. So all of a sudden, they're starting to engage. Their stages of learning are starting to link with their memory. And they're starting to create a place for that information to sit and to fit. Can I assume that this is the same idea that I had yesterday or last month? Okay, well, I thought I knew this, but maybe I need to check this out. So active classrooms give opportunities for information to be better processed, and we can look at our 4 stages of learning. We collect information, we process it. Retention, we keep what we think is learning, and then we use it. Okay, we actually take it back to the real world and we use it as an application. Our levels of memory, okay, when we collect information, we're aware of a stimulus. It could be a smell, it could be a taste, and that may connect you back to a childhood memory. So you can see what we're talking about here. The stimulus comes in, the brain level picks it up at a sensory level. Immediately, we acquire it in seconds to minutes. Oh, that's the smell of chocolate cookies. I get that. The working memory, rehearsal, minutes to hours. Okay, how do we make chocolate cookies? Let me find a recipe. Okay, oh, here's the steps. Here are the ingredients. And here's what I have to do. Retention, long term. Those chocolate cookies were really good. That recipe was a huge success. Otto Lengi makes great chocolate cookies. Or Sarah Wilson, or whoever it is you follow. Your levels of memory. Engage students with graphic organisers. Some of the other techniques that are coming out of this week's discussions. Concept maps, description maps, cause and effect maps, time sequence maps. Okay, and we can actually have a look, for instance, at the development of scientific periods, prehistoric, the evolution of man. We can do as all of these different concepts. Barriers to engagement. We can look at this. Science is given a low priority in schools, 30 to 60 minutes per week. Okay, let's do science now, and everything else stops. It's a little bit like the Bible. This happened on that day, and this happened on that day. Nothing else happened on that day, just this happened on that day, and it gets written down. Unfortunately, this is the approach we have to science. Instead of having a graffiti board where science is alive, instead of having a graffiti board where students are recording information about species monitoring at their school grounds or in their neighbourhoods, or Excel spreadsheets posted on Google Docs where students are constantly updating observations of their environment or their local water systems, Science is given a task-oriented curriculum space. The timetable is perhaps the biggest barrier to real learning in schools, but it's necessary for administration. Science is not taught with relevance. There are not enough experiments and hands-on, and often when they happen, it's the teacher doing them and the students observing. There's too much content. Students, some teachers and parents often think it's too hard, and there is a gender divide here. This is one of our big challenges as a teacher. Get your mothers into the classroom. Get your mothers to be domestic scientists. There are some fantastic applications for around the home that measure actually products and their toxicity. So when you go shopping, you can turn that into a science lesson. Okay? There's too much writing in science. Okay, and not enough actual reflection and thought. And we can go back to our previous slide, 6 slides ago, where we looked at a little science classroom. Where is your conversation pit? Where is your whiteboard, your teaching area? Where is your kinesthetics, your touch, your real life centre? All of these things need to coexist. So the elements of good teaching, we can see teaching for engagement, learning and understanding sits at the middle of this framework. And if we're going to do that, we need to evaluate learning and respond by, through reflection. So we need to be a reflective practitioner ourselves. In order to talk about engagement, we need to be engaging teachers. We need to be engaging people. Okay? Engagement can't be something we do. It's got to be something we are. We've got to ask questions of yourself over here, of the curriculum and of students. Why are we studying this? Why am I teaching this? What do I need to know about this? Okay? What would Albert Einstein think of this? If you don't find you've got the thinking yourself to do it, put yourself in role. Take on a scientific role and act out a role-play situation. Develop your own understanding of concepts and teaching. And this is what makes a good teacher. And again, we go to the constructivist models here. The 5E is a constructivist framework. You're deeply embedded in engagement. You're deeply embedded in pushing students through to the evaluation stage, where you are acting in 3 distinct roles. You're acting as the guide on the side, where you can mentor and motivate. You're acting as the sage on the stage, where you can lecture and direct and teach. And then you're also acting as the meddler in the middle, Vygotsky, where you're walking around tapping students on the shoulder, where you're pointing, where you're laughing, where you're asking why. And these are all the elements of good teaching. And finally, identify and prepare resources, including safety awareness. Okay, because every student needs to be safe in your class, whether they're safe from bullying, whether they're safe from emotional or cognitive challenges. Things must be brought to them in a safe environment. No one should be hurt in the name of science. Planning a lesson. Make sure you read your text for this section. Activity 8, use the unit plan Matters. And choose part of that unit and design a single lesson. Try to make it 60 long, and some strategies. Here's just a tip, some things that I'd really like to see you try and include. And do this exercise, please, because you will find yourself out on track, and it'd be lovely to have one that you could roll out. It may not be the same topic, but what we're talking about here are the strategies, engagement strategies. Get students to state information in their own words. Have partner discussions. Make the classroom active. Response cards. Pose a question. Students fill in a card and they hand it back in anonymously. It's safe. No one gets hurt. Have a panel and a fishbowl. Give them a task one day, send them home to research, and then pull them out in random panels. Today's fishbowl topic, for instance, is what's happening in our local environment. Teams of 2 to 4, based on their birthdays. Okay, put them together in their birthdays. Get them together so they create an instant sense of belonging. Think of an application. Think of an application for any of these tasks. See connections between it and other ideas. Open discussion. Polling. Do a short survey. Recall prior material. Draw and label a flowchart. Draft answers. Create a solution. Propose a test. Celebrity Heads is a fantastic game. I remember when I went to Myanmar, I was in teaching in a school. Actually, it was a monk college. And we would trying to teach a whole range of concepts related to democracy and philosophy, and to get it going, of course, we used the game of celebrity heads, and I actually made my son-in-law Lady Gaga, who they really, really enjoyed, and much to my delight, they knew Lady Gaga inside out, and actually some of them performed some of her more popular songs. So, games, you know, fantastic way of breaking down and creating engagement. Whip-arounds, short answers. Tell me this, what do you think? Give examples of. You can see that the momentum, you can see that there's no safe learning place to hide, there's nowhere to disengage. So when you're planning a lesson, think about some of these strategies. That brings